All right, welcome back, everyone. So we are going to have our final speaker and our Humane Hoax team member, Sina Crutchley, will be introducing her. Sina is a longtime animal activist, runs a micro sanctuary, and she will be introducing our next speaker.
So Ingrid Taylor is a writer, veterinarian, and independent scholar who has worked in veterinary clinical practice, public health, and animal protection. She's an award-winning poet, and her writing has appeared in many journals and magazines. Her creative work involves topics around ecology, ecofeminism, disability, and mental health awareness, and the list goes on. I really wanted to introduce Ingrid because her chapter, A Pig Called Silver, hit me so deeply that every time I talk about it, I feel like I'm trying to fight back tears. When we talked about her chapter during that episode 78 of Hope's podcast, it felt like forever before I could really compose myself. So anyway, welcome, Ingrid Taylor. Thank you for speaking for us.
Thank you so much. I thank you all for coming today and for sticking around for my presentation. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to join earlier due to a scheduling conflict, but I really hope I'll be able to catch the recordings of all the previous presentations. And I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen. So give me just a second to get my slides up. This is always the tricky part. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about the welfare costs of pastured pigs, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal experience and background growing up on a pastured pig farm. And I'm also going to talk a bit more in general about what the welfare costs and impacts on pigs are of being out on pasture. So I'd like to first off thank Hope for including my essay in this latest Humane Hoax book. And it's been an incredible honor to be included among the very long list of amazing advocates and scholars for animals that are part of the contributors to this book. So I'm just going to start out telling a little bit about the story of a pig named Silver, who I had a personal relationship with when I was growing up on our pig farm. And before I jump into that, I do just want to quickly address terminology a little bit, because I do, if I recall in my book chapter, I think I did refer to female pigs as sows. For this presentation, I have consciously made an effort not to do that, even though that is the recognized technical term and the recognized industry term for female pigs. I will be calling them either mothers or female pigs. I do feel like the term sow is objectifying, so I just wanted to address that up front. It's not that I don't know that that is the term that is commonly used, but that I think because it serves to objectify these female pigs who are also mothers, I'm not going to use it for this presentation. So just to begin, I spent several years growing up as a child on a pastured pig farm in the Midwest. And what I mean by pastured pig farms are farms where instead of being confined inside in intensive confinement in a building, pastured pigs actually, they have the opportunity, they're out on pasture. So they're outdoors predominantly, and they do have more room to roam around in, although as I'll talk about later, these areas are still fairly confined, but they're generally kept outdoors for the majority of their lifetime. So for our particular farm, we raised piglets for feedlots, which meant that our stable population of pigs were about 40 female pigs who would be bred over and over, and then they would produce litter after litter. Those piglets would be weaned around 2 to 3 weeks of age, And then in about 1 to 2 months, they would be sent away to feedlots where they would be kept until they were at slaughter weight. This is something that the industry calls finishing, which means they would be basically fed until they reach slaughter weight, and then they would be sent to the slaughterhouse. So in addition to the female pigs, we would have a couple of male pigs. I actually don't recall if we had one or more than one for our farm, but that was the general setup of our farm. And again, most of the pigs would spend most of their lifetime outside. If they were going to be bred, then the female pigs would be put into a pen with the male pig for breeding. And they would also be brought indoors to a farrowing pen, which is not the same as a farrowing crate, it's larger. But they would be brought indoors to a farrowing pen when they were giving birth. That is, if they could be caught and brought in before they actually gave birth out on pasture. So that's just a little bit of the setup of the farm that I grew up on. And among these litters of piglets, infant mortality was pretty high. There would be issues like they could die of exposure, they could die of disease, they could potentially be small and sickly and not able to get enough nutrition, and they could die that way. And oftentimes the littlest piglets, are called the runts of the litter, would either just be allowed to die on their own, or sometimes they would be killed using blunt force trauma. So this is something that is called thumping, where the hind legs of the pigs are taken and then they're swung into the ground and essentially killed in that way. So Silver was one of the pigs in our litter, and she was a very tiny pig, and we assumed that she wasn't going to survive. So most likely her fate would have been either to just die on her own or to be killed and gotten rid of that way. But for some reason, my mother saw Silver and decided to bring her into our house and actually raise her with us and raise her within our home. So that was, as far as I can recall, the first and only time that we had ever done that on our farm. And so we brought Silver inside, we set her up in a nice cozy bed downstairs, we bottle fed her, and she grew and thrived and really became part of our family. She played with us, she ran around the house, she was very interactive. I don't know if anyone here, I'm going to assume among this audience, probably some of you have shared time and space with pigs and probably know how incredibly affectionate and interactive and fun they can be. And Silver was all of those things. She was, she really became part of our family. She was a playmate to my brother and I. Loved to play with toys. But the thing was that she grew, and even though she never grew to be the same as large as the other pigs who were out on pasture, she did grow too large to continue to be kept in the home. At which point my parents decided she needed to go back outside with the pigs out on pasture. And at that point, once she was transitioned out to the pasture and to the general pig population, she really never adjusted to that. She became a very solitary pig, and just never really formed connections with the other pigs in the herd or really got along with any of the other pigs. My father decided he was going to try to breed her to get her into the breeding rotation on the farm, and she refused that. She fought off every pig. She was never successfully bred. She just didn't want to have anything to do with that. And whenever my brother and my mother or I would walk out towards the pasture, no matter where she was out on pasture, no matter how far away, she would just come barreling across the pasture right up to the fence, and she would either stick her nose through the slats or she'd jump up on the fence to greet us. She never really understood why she had been exiled from her home. She never understood why we were suddenly no longer her family when that was all she had known growing up. And she because of that, she never was really able to integrate in with the other pigs in the herd. So as I was researching this chapter and thinking more about Silver and kind of delving more into that background, I had to have a few phone calls with my mother to kind of try to remember some of the details of what had happened. And we had a conversation about what had happened ultimately to Silver, because as I was trying to write this chapter, I realized I couldn't remember what had happened to Silver. And so when I was talking to my mom, we both, she said to me, well, I think Silver just lived out her life on the farm, and she was fine, and she just lived out her life. And we both kind of sat there for a minute and just sort of sat with that. And I think we kind of both came to the same realization around the same time, like that while we may have wanted to believe that, in reality, it's very unlikely that that is what had happened. So what is most likely to have happened is that Silver probably got sent to slaughter. I think if that did happen, it's probably a memory I've blocked out, but apparently my mother did too. But we both kind of came to that realization at the same time, like, well, Silver didn't have a happy ending, and neither did any of the other pigs on our farm. They all ultimately ended up at the place where all pigs in the meat industry go, which is on the slaughterhouse floor. And so even the female pigs who were used for breeding would ultimately face that fate as well, if they became unproductive or if they were becoming less productive. So that was, I think, a really hard truth that I was faced with as I was writing this chapter, that not only did Silver face this horrible fate, but it was the same fate that all of the pigs on our farm ultimately went to. So, of course, to me, Silver was incredibly unique and special because she was a companion of mine who had lived in the home. And it was years later that I realized that Silver wasn't actually unique among pigs, and that all pigs experience the same type of deep and lasting emotions, and that all pigs form significant emotional connections, and they are all intelligent and cognitively complex. And the false premise of pastured pig farming is that it creates this idyllic vision of blissful pigs. And it's often contrasted with the abuses of intensive farming, which is also called concentrated animal feeding operations, or the term that many people may recognize, factory farming, which is where pigs are kept in those really intensive indoor conditions, as opposed to pastured farming where they are outdoors. So pastured pig farming is really often set up as a better way to farm pigs as opposed to intensive farming. But the truth is that there is no better way to do this. And keeping pigs out on pasture has just as much consequences to their welfare and their well-being as does intensive or factory farming. It's just that those consequences might be a little bit different in each of these circumstances. So one thing about growing up on a pastured pig farm is that it was neither idyllic nor humane. And the truth was that both the animals and humans on farms like these live precarious lives. The pigs, of course, because they are essentially objectified and being used at the whim of humans, but the humans on the farm also face issues like economic insecurity, the trauma of living on the farm, and many other issues. And in addition, there's also other animals on the farm. We had a lot of barn cats. We had other animals on the farm, and there was really nothing that was really idyllic about that existence. As a child growing up on a farm like this, my childhood was really marked by a lot of violence and contradiction. And part of that was, as a child, I did really want to care for these animals. I wanted to interact with them. And yet I was faced with a lot of these very violent acts that my family perpetrated against these animals. So that created a lot of internal conflict and a lot of contradiction, where there were a lot of mixed messaging where it's okay to care in certain circumstances, like we cared enough about Silver to bring her into our home, but ultimately didn't care enough to ensure that she had a good ending to her life. So it's really a constant betrayal of the animals who are in our care. And as a result of this, I've grown up with a very complex relationship with pigs, where I truly love and adore pigs, but there's also a lot of guilt and I guess guilt and just very complex feelings associated with that relationship. So this false premise that pastured pigs have better lives than pigs in other situations capitalizes on a couple of things. And one is the human tendency to want to turn away from animal suffering. Most people don't want to feel like they're contributing to animal suffering. And the way that pastured pig farming is framed, it kind of gives an out from that, where it also capitalizes on the idea that by making an animal's life incrementally better, we can kill and consume that animal with less guilt. But as I mentioned before, pastured pigs have their own set of welfare concerns, and they not only face the same physical and psychological violations that pigs in CAFOs experience, but they also have some unique challenges to their welfare that come as a result of being raised out on pasture. So what exactly does it mean to raise pigs on pasture? This is something that has really emerged as a niche market for welfare and environmentally conscious consumers. And it includes not only general pastured pig operations, but also organic pastured pig operations. And again, this means that pigs are allowed access to the outdoors, often in large pens and fenced areas. So again, it's not like they have acres and acres to roam on. That is actually neither practical nor feasible, but they are outdoors in fairly large pens and fenced areas where they do have the opportunity to graze and forage. And pastured pig farming is actually not a new concept. Around 150 years ago in the US, it was the predominant model of pig farming. And until industrialization occurred within the farming industry and the industry moved more towards intensification. But prior to that, all pig farms were basically based on this pastured idea. So common arguments that come from the meat industry for raising pigs on pasture include that it's sustainable, that the pigs are healthier to eat, and that the pigs are happier. And the marketing of pastured pig products really focuses on the close relationships between the farmers and the animals. In the course of my research on this chapter, I looked at a lot of different websites for farms that were advertising their products. And a lot of them included these stories and these vignettes of interactions between the farmers and the animals, and how much care and regard there was between farmers and animals, and how much the pigs liked the farmers. And that also plays into this image of these happy, healthy pigs. There were also depictions of whimsical descriptions of pigs' behavior, like rooting and playing, and an emphasis on the fact that these pigs could express natural behaviors like foraging and grazing. So this is something I found really interesting because practically based on my background living on a farm like this, we really didn't have a close relationship with our pigs. And I also knew of other farms in the area where the situation was the same. Pigs are so smart, and they know when they're being abused, and they know when they're being used. And most of the time, our interactions with the pigs were negative, either because of doing some sort of invasive procedure, taking their piglets away, forcing them to move from one spot to another, which generally was done in a rushed way and often using force. So it's really interesting that this image is so predominant in advertisements and on websites, when in reality, this was not something that I ever really saw when I was growing up on a pig farm. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the reality is then for pastured pigs. And the truth is that it is not a more sustainable farming model, and the pigs are not happier and healthier out on pasture. So the sustainability argument is really not what it appears to be. And this assertion that basically at the crux of this argument is this assertion that if it's properly managed, then grazing pigs can actually benefit pastures by eating the weeds and leaving their manure as fertilizer. However, this is something that requires very precise management and lots of space. It would mean being able to rotate between very large pastures on a very precise rotation schedule. And this has just not proven to be feasible in reality. And in fact, this assertion has not been demonstrated in any actual farming system. So there is basically no evidence that this will actually work when grazing pigs. The other issue is that large groups of pigs can be quite detrimental to the environment, particularly when they're kept in a contained area. Because of their rooting and foraging activities, they will disrupt soil structure. They will also kill trees and plants by damaging and uprooting them. And they often leave pastures barren if they're left on a pasture to forage. And even when they're pastured, again, large groups of pigs are still contained. And because of this, their waste becomes contained in a specific area. And this does still contribute to runoff and environmental pollution, including contamination of soil and surrounding waterways. So a 219 study that I looked at showed that pastured pig operations also contributed significantly to acidification of the environment, which not only affects soil health, but also has some very detrimental effects on surrounding aquatic environments, including to fish populations and amphibian populations. Pigs on pasture also need access to high energy forage, which means that they can't really exist on this natural mixed grasses. They don't get enough of that higher energy forage from that. So that means for pastured pig operations to be successful, then fields have to be plowed and crops have to be planted. And then the pigs are put on the pasture to eat the crops, which is not sustainable, which is not as an environmentally friendly or sustainable system as opposed to the mixed grass pasture model. Pigs on pasture also require supplemental feed, and the ways that supplemental feed is grown and produced, which is often monocropping, is not something that's environmentally sustainable. So to the question, are pastured pigs happier and healthier than pigs in intensive operations? The answer to that is no, based on my research and based on my experience living on a farm like this, but they do have some different and unique stressors. So some of the welfare costs that are unique to pastured pigs include things like pasture hazards, weather, predation, pathogens, and parasitism. And pigs who are out on pasture run the risk of being in constant wet, dirty, and muddy conditions. They often don't have an opportunity to get out of these conditions. They don't have a chance to get clean and dry, and they're just kind of stuck in this area where they're not able to clean themselves or be comfortable, which is something that will impact both their physical and mental well-being. And I do recall from our pastures on our farm, depending on the time of the year, sometimes our pastures were just completely mud with maybe a few trampled down plants. And there were large portions of the year when the pigs were just constantly dirty and constantly muddy and constantly existing in slippery conditions. And although pigs do love to have mud wallows to wallow in, they don't want to spend all of their time in mud. They do really appreciate and need the opportunity to clean themselves and to not be covered in mud and dirt and be in wet conditions all the time. But unfortunately, this is one of the things that pigs on pasture often face. Pigs will also face injuries from holes, stumps, wires, slips, and falls. And kind of specific to pastured pigs, they have issues with ingrown claws and toe erosion, both of which are painful conditions that can impair mobility and impact well-being. Pigs on pastures are also exposed to toxic metals. The way that pigs root and forage and graze, they will actually ingest a fair amount of soil in the process of doing that. And that soil is often contaminated with toxic metals, which can then concentrate in their tissues and their internal organs. Pigs can also be exposed to toxic plants and toxic mushrooms on pasture, which can result in illness and even death if they ingest them. Another hazard of pastured pigs is that they face delayed veterinary care due to the difficulty in observing and finding injured pigs. And I just wanted to add another little piece to that because it's actually quite uncommon for individual pigs to get veterinary care in any case on farms like this. So as an example, on our farm, there were often pigs who were injured or had cuts and scrapes or other injuries. And it didn't make economic sense when you're looking at them as products to call out a veterinarian to treat an individual pig. And where veterinary care really comes into play for farming operations like this is if it's a potential illness that could potentially affect the entire herd, like an infectious illness or transmissible illness that may affect the economic viability of the entire herd. So while delayed veterinary care is an issue, another issue is complete absence of veterinary care for individual animals in situations like this. So pastured pigs also face a lot of hazards from weather. They can face issues of heat stress if they don't have adequate places where they can go to get out of the heat or have adequate shade areas. Pigs in general are actually very susceptible to heat stress and to heat stroke. So this is a really significant hazard for pigs out on pasture. They also face the hazard of sunburn, which again, if they don't have adequate shelter, then their skin can become sunburned, which is a very painful condition for them. Many of our modern pig breeds that are raised for meat are light-skinned with very little hair, so they don't have really any natural protection to keep them from getting sunburned. So they are at a really high risk of this. They're also at risk of plant photosensitization. There are certain plants that can be eaten out on pasture that can cause them to become more sensitive to the sun. And this can cause really painful skin lesions that look like peeling and burning and ulceration. And this is a really painful condition that is a very real risk for pigs out on pasture. Again, they're unable to migrate anywhere because even though they do have more room to move, they're still confined and they can't seek out appropriate shelter. They also face issues like cold stress and wind stress. And wind stress is something that actually really detrimentally affects pigs. They don't like not being able to get out of the wind, and it can affect things like immune system and growth and their ability to really metabolize their nutrition properly. So that's another huge factor in their welfare when they're out on pasture. Predation is another issue. And this is predation from wild animals that can get to them when they're outdoors. Piglets are most commonly taken by predators. And in some studies and research that I looked at for this chapter, in both the US and Australia, there were high numbers of missing and unaccounted for pigs, mostly piglets, in pastured operations that were most likely missing due to predation. Another risk of predation is that larger pigs will break down fences and run, which not only causes them injury, but also when they leave behind the piglets, then those piglets will either be taken by predators or they may just die of exposure because they no longer have the protection and care of the larger pigs who have fled the area. Parasites are a huge issue in pastured pig farms. And this has become pretty much an intractable issue in organic pastured pig operations, to the point where it's just simply accepted that there is not going to be any way to get rid of parasite loads for these pigs out on pasture. And this includes external parasites like lice, as well as internal parasites like roundworms and whipworms. And these parasites can cause poor nutrition and growth, diarrhea, sometimes cramping and nausea. So they not only impact the growth of the pigs, but also impact their well-being in terms of they may not be feeling very well if they have heavy parasite loads. And a couple of studies that I looked at, one looked across 5 US states, looked at all the organic pig farming operations in those states. And all of the pig farms surveyed had at least one parasite species on their property that was infecting their animals. Another study that I looked at that also looked at pastured pig farming operations in the US found that rates of infection among pig populations on pasture ranged from 10 to 100%. So this is a really huge problem for keeping pigs out on pasture. Pigs out on pasture are also at risk of pathogens from things like rodent vectors. So rodents can carry diseases like leptospirosis, and they can infect the pastured pigs with these diseases. They're also at risk of transmission from wild animals of diseases, and also depending on the area, they may be at risk of transmission back and forth between the pastured pig operations and feral pig populations. They can spread diseases back and forth between these two types of herds. The pastured pig operations have also been found contaminated with high levels of Salmonella, Campylobacter, Toxoplasma, and Trichinella. And again, these not only cause significant welfare issues and health issues for the pigs, but these are also significant public health risks as well. So, because pastured pigs are not confined and they do have the ability to move around, they are more active, which has often been thought to be an indicator of greater welfare. However, more recent research into this is showing that this is not necessarily the case. Although, it does make sense. Of course, it's better to have more room and to be able to move around more, but the ways in which they're active on pasture are actually in a lot of ways working against their welfare. So as one example of that, they do require greater calorie intake, but pigs on pasture often suffer from underfeeding. They often can't get what they need from pasture. And if the farmers are not giving them correct supplemental feeding or giving them enough food or enough access to forage, then they're just going to be hungry all the time. And that not only has physical ramifications, but also has psychological ramifications for their well-being. They also face issues with thirst and lack of clean water. They may not always have access to consistent water sources or clean water sources. Water sources can freeze over, they can dry up. So that is a constant risk for pigs out on pasture. And all of these circumstances lead to higher rates of both mother and piglet mortality among pastured pig herds when compared to pigs in concentrated feeding operations. And I'm just going to say, I'm making this comparison more to kind of bring across the point that there are different and just as urgent and serious welfare concerns between these two pig populations, not to in any way diminish the suffering that happens to pigs in intensive operations. So I just want to make that clear. So another issue with having pigs out on pasture is that modern breeds are not well adapted to living on pasture. They are, at this point, many generations separated from the pigs who lived out on pasture. They are much larger in terms of size and weight, and even the so-called heritage breeds are not at this point really well adapted to an outdoor lifestyle based on what has happened with their breeding over subsequent generations. So the other thing that pastured pigs face are inhumane management practices. And these are practices that are faced by all pigs in the meat industry, regardless of whether they're in intensive operations or pastured operations. And these practices include invasive physical harms, like castration without anesthesia or pain management, early weaning, and also transport to the slaughterhouse and then ultimately slaughter. So early weaning is something that is commonly practiced on pastured pig farms. And on our farm, we usually weaned the piglets around 2 to 3 weeks of age, which is very, very young. The average across pastured pig farms is about 2 to 5 weeks. But if piglets were allowed to remain with their mothers naturally, then weaning would be a very gradual and slow process that would occur around 17 weeks of age. So the piglets would continue to derive the benefits of their mother's milk up until about 17 weeks, while they would be gradually switching over to solid food. And the practice of early weaning that takes place on farms really causes a lot of distress to mothers and piglets. And for the piglets, it results in negative effects on their immune system, their growth, their ability to feed, as well as their intestinal structure and function. And it's also been found that the earlier that they are weaned, the more likely to exhibit higher levels of stress and fear they are in general. So what this means is these little piglets are weaned around 2 to 3 weeks. And then at about 1 month, they're taken to a feedlot where they're thrown in with all these other strange pigs in this crowded condition. They are not going to have the same coping skills as piglets who were weaned later in life, and they're going to experience more profound stress and fear as a result of that. Not that any pig wouldn't experience stress and fear in that situation, but there's a lot of really serious detrimental effects that occur with early weaning. There are also invasive procedures, like I had already mentioned castration. All of the male piglets on our farm were castrated, and this was done without anesthesia or pain medication. And on the days when piglets were castrated, this I have to say this is like one of the probably the some of the most horrific memories that I have of growing up on this farm, because I could really see the kind of distress that this caused, not only to the piglets, but also to the mother pigs. So they would all, when the castration was done in a barn, at a different location away from the pasture, but the mother pigs could still hear the piglets screaming and struggling. So they all gathered along the fence line of the pasture, and it was very obvious that they were in a lot of distress over this. And of course, for the piglets, this is an excruciatingly painful procedure. It is often done by people who have no medical training, have no understanding of physiology or anatomy, and were most likely just taught how to do it by someone else on the farm at some point. So that not only leads to incredible pain and suffering for these piglets, but also a high risk of complications from these procedures, including infections, inguinal herniation. We often had piglets with inguinal hernias that would sometimes even grow so big that they would drag on the ground, they would become ulcerated. And of course, this was not anything that they ever received any veterinary care for. Other invasive procedures included tooth clipping, which is cutting off the canine teeth. And this is, even though the term clipping sounds kind of benign, it's actually quite a painful procedure. And it not only can cause pain, but it can cause fractures and an unwillingness to eat or an inability to eat. So there are a lot of ramifications to that procedure. And then, of course, tail amputation, which is a removal of the end of the tail with no anesthesia and no pain medication. And this procedure not only causes immediate acute pain, but can also cause long-term chronic pain in terms of the formation of neuromas at the site of the amputation. So the other thing that all pigs face, even pigs who are raised on pasture, they are ultimately transported to slaughter. And in the US, there are not a lot of slaughterhouses that are equipped for slaughtering large size pigs. So what this means for pig populations on pastured farms is often long distances of transport in any type of weather, in trucks that are open to the elements with poor ventilation. So this results in issues like cold stress, heat stress. If it's very cold, perhaps even cold stress injury, including things like frostbite or even freezing to the floor or the sides of the transport truck. Pigs are also basically crowded together in transport trucks. They may be from several different farms in one transport truck. So that results in overcrowding, injuries from fighting and aggression between pigs. For any of you who may know pigs, they are wonderful animals, but they can be really tricky to introduce new pigs to existing herds or to existing groups. So anytime that they're thrown together like this, there is a risk of severe injuries due to fighting. And during transport, they also face food and water restriction, which means they may go for a few days with no food and no water until they get to the slaughterhouse. Another hazard of transport is truck accidents, which is something that is not infrequent, where transport trucks carrying pigs may get into an accident, may turn over, and this results in severe pain and injury and trauma to the pigs who experience this. And of course, there is slaughter, which is where all pigs in the meat industry end up, regardless of whether they were mother pigs used for breeding or whether they were piglets who were finished in feeding lots. So slaughter comes with its own set of inhumane practices, including inadequate stunning and inhumane stunning practices, which cause distress and pain, particularly the practice of CO2 gassing in pigs. And as a result of inadequate stunning, pigs may be conscious through the slaughter line, and which means that they are experiencing, basically they can be awake as they're experiencing the steps of slaughter, which of course is an excruciatingly painful and terrifying process. And in order to move them off the trucks and into the slaughter line, they are subjected to prodding, beating, and electroshocks. So while pastured pig farming is often presented as being the best of both worlds, meaning that the pigs get to live happy, natural lives while people still get to eat them, the truth is that this type of operation is not the best of both worlds. And there are very significant welfare costs to pigs who are in pastured farming operations. So there really is no better way to do this. And even though intensification or factory farming is often seen by consumers as the worst evil of the food system, that these pastured operations, again, are just as bad, even though they may be just as bad in different ways. So by buying into the myths of pastured pig farming, this means that pigs will still suffer, but all we're doing is exchanging one set of welfare costs for another. And ultimately, this is an equation that simply doesn't balance out. So to conclude, I'm actually just going to read a little bit from my chapter just to kind of bring Silver's story full circle here and to go ahead and kind of bring it back to the farm and to the end of the talk. Silver never got over thinking we were her family, but it took me years to realize how deep our betrayal had been of her love and trust. Today, it shatters me to think of her so isolated, in a strange and harsh situation outside of the home she'd grown up in, not understanding why we no longer played together or took lazy afternoon naps in the sun on the living room floor. When I remember my childhood on the farm, I see Silver trotting toward me with a toy in her mouth. I see the dozens of pigs, still babies, and no different from Silver in their desire to run and play, loaded on the truck to be taken to barren, crowded feedlots. I see them still, and I am haunted by their ghosts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid. That was fantastic. Such great information. I mean, anyone that is buying organic pork, pastured pork, any kind of alternative label, they need to hear this presentation and read your chapter. It was really, really, really well put together and such a wealth of information. Thank you so much. I saw something in the chat about how pigs' tails are so expressive, you know, just like a dog's tail, how they will waggle their tail, and how horrible it is that tail docking, cutting of the tail is so just ubiquitous. I mean, that's what they all do, is cut off the tails. So just horrible. And then someone else mentioned about nose rings. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mentioned that in my chapter because that is a practice that happens to pastured pigs as well, because they are confined in a specific area, and because when they're confined like that, they can be damaging to a pasture. In order to try to preserve the pasture, some farming operations will put these kind of like barbed nose rings in their noses, which means that they can't actually use their noses to dig and forage, which is of course, a major welfare issue, because that's something that pigs love to do and need to do, is to be able to root and forage by using their nose. So yeah, so that's one thing that doesn't happen in every pastured operation, but it happens in some, and that of course is an additional significant welfare issue. And very misleading, because you're saying pigs are doing their natural activities out on pasture, but then they can't do that. Then they're being restricted from even doing that.
Yeah. Well, so we want to open it up to questions. We can continue questions specifically for Ingrid or for any of the speakers. Karen has joined us again. Robert is still here. And we have the whole Humane Hoax team here that can also ask questions, join in, contribute answers, thoughts, whatever we want to do. So did anyone see any questions anywhere that they might want to either bring in from the group or ask yourself? Anyone? Sure, Fireweed.
Ingrid, that was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much. I'm very curious to know about your family relationships. Do you care to comment on that probably delicate terrain?
You mean like currently what the family relationship is now, or?
Yeah. I mean, it's always incredibly fascinating to me when people break the chain, coming from that place of exposure to the industry and really, going in a brand new direction away from your family's orientation. I'm assuming at least the core family. Is that something that's important for you to talk to people about?
Well, I'm not, my family was not a well-established farming family. My father was actually the first person to embark on this endeavor. And our farm, actually, our farm kind of failed along with a lot of other farms during the early 80s, where things were pretty rough for the farming industry. So it wasn't really economically viable. My mother hated the farm. She was from Washington, DC, and was kind of a city person. And she not only didn't like the violence of the farm, but just also the amount of work that it entailed, and really the economic precarity of it. I mean, we were always living hand to mouth, struggling. So eventually our farm just, it wasn't economically viable. So that's why my parents got out of it. And my father has passed away. I never had an opportunity to discuss any of this with him. But my mother and I have talked about this, and she really did a lot to, I think, try to undo some of that damage of living my early life on a farm, and really, encouraging me to be more compassionate and to really explore other ways of having relationships with animals that weren't exploitive. So I really do owe a lot to her for that. And I think that helped a lot to set me on a different path. And I will also say, sorry, this is turning into a long answer. When I decided to go to veterinary school, I also took an alternative path for veterinary school, where I got a master's degree in international studies, as opposed to doing the traditional animal agricultural degree type background that a lot of people do to get into veterinary school. And I'm bringing that up because I think it's very important, in case there are any pre-vet students or people interested in veterinary school listening to that going like the animal ag education route is not necessarily the best way to really, I don't think it's necessarily what the profession needs, is for its students to come from that background. And I think doing that alternative route really, when I came into veterinary school, I had a much more expansive understanding and vision of what I wanted to accomplish. So that might be a lot. I don't know. Hopefully I didn't get too off track from the question.
No, that's fascinating. Thank you.